You know, for a long, long time, I had a hard time being a baseball fan. You all can understand why, I think. For my parents' generation, they would often tell stories about the We Are Family generation. You know, Bill Mazeroski and Clemente and Stargell, and how the glory days of Pirates baseball, and everybody bowed to the legacy of the Pittsburgh Pirates, how wonderful a team they were. And then in addition to having the Pirates, they also had an amazing Steelers franchise, the Immaculate Reception, and multiple Super Bowl rings, and just dominance in the NFL. And while we didn't really much have a strong hockey team, but we also still at that time had the Miracle on Ice that my parents' generation would often talk about, and how it just was an amazing event to see. It was the 1980 Olympics, to see the hockey team just dominate the world in that sport. For my generation, though, I would hear all these stories about wonderful, amazing legacies of powerful sports franchises. And in my generation, we had the Pirates, or we had the Steelers. The Steelers were, winning here and there, and we had some respect in the NFL. We had the Penguins, of course, in the mid-90s, and then again in the mid-2000s. Things were great for the Penguins, and so we were really popular in those two leagues. But being a baseball person, which I've always been, has been a really tough road. When Aaron and we lived in Tennessee for about 7 years, and I was one of the few people that followed baseball at the time at all, but we had this common area in one of the rooms at our university that you could watch like cable. We didn't get cable in your own dorm room or anything like that. So you had to actually go to these common areas, and occasionally you'd have like those national broadcast baseball games on TV. And once in a blue moon, they'd actually have the Pirate game on this national broadcast. It didn't never really happen, but once in a blue moon it did. And I can remember going down to this common area and watching the baseball game with my friends and just being ridiculed the whole time. And when the Pirates had a season opener, and I don't remember what year it was, maybe 2006, in Atlanta, Georgia. And of course we were in East Tennessee at the time, so that wasn't a very far drive. And I got some friends together who were baseball fans, not necessarily Pirate fans, baseball fans, who would join me in this epic drive down to Atlanta to go to Turner Field and to see the Pirates take on the Braves in the season opener. And I remember I was dressed up, of course, in my black and gold and my Pirate stuff on. And I remember the whole time walking into Turner Field being told, "There's still Pirate fans out there? Like, you guys still exist? You guys are still around?" And I distinctly remember telling one guy, we're at a restaurant, grabbing something to eat for lunch before we got to the stadium. I distinctly remember telling one guy, miracles still happen. Miracles still happen. I was clinging to a miracle. There was no reasonable expectation that the Pirates were going to do anything that year. They didn't do anything that year, but I was still desperate for a miracle with my franchise and my team. And I clung to it as desperately as I could. Last year, on this week, most of you remember what happened. Wild card game against the Cincinnati Reds. It was the night in which I didn't stop crying the entire night. I didn't really care if we won or we lost. We were in the playoffs, man. The playoffs were in Pittsburgh, and I was in front of the TV, tears running down my cheeks. I was just a mess because the miracle had finally happened. I don't know how many of you have seen The Matrix, but you know how like in The Matrix time stops and like and Neo and all them can do like these crazy moves, and it's like not the time never passes in reality, but they're really quick. That's kind of what it felt like that night in the wild card game. The time had just stopped. The world had just frozen, and the Pirates were in the playoffs, and they won that game. It was an amazing night for me and for many Pirate fans who were clinging to that miracle. But it truly felt like on that night, last year, this week, that time had literally stopped. Time had stopped. You know, in the past couple months, we've been reading through the book of Joshua. And we've been working through the book of Joshua in this sermon series called Conquerors. And we've seen God do some amazing stuff happening. And the story of Joshua, if you haven't been with us, the story of Joshua is the story of God leading Israel to the conquest of Canaan. God's finally leading them into the promised land. God's finally having the Israelites experience the fulfillment of the promise He made to them hundreds and hundreds of years prior. And so they're finally seeing God doing some mighty, mighty things. This new generation of Israelites are finally seeing God do something powerful. And we've seen God do some amazing things. We've seen him stop the flow of the Jordan River. Miles and miles away from where the Israelites even crossed the river, God stopped the flow of the Jordan River. The Israelites were able to cross the Jordan River at flood stage during harvest season on perfectly solid ground. They didn't get wet with one drop. And then we've seen God also take care of Jericho, the mightiest city, the mightiest powerhouse in the land of Canaan at this time, without even throwing one weapon at the city. The walls came tumbling down by them just marching around the city. It was a most random and unexpected strategy that God had for the Israelites to date, and he told them just to march around the city like they're having some sort of parade, and the walls just come tumbling down. And God did that. God fulfilled this amazing promise and did this amazing miracle for the Israelites. It's a fantastic story. And we've also seen, if you've been reading along, we didn't exactly cover the story, but we've seen how God also gave the city of Ai to the Israelites. And God, again, just been doing miracle after miracle after miracle for the Israelites. Mighty, powerful things. Amazing things for the Israelites. But nothing compares to the miracle he's about to fulfill for the Israelites in the story we're going to read from this morning. Nothing compares to what God is about to do for the Israelites in Joshua chapter 10. Joshua chapter 10, we don't need to pull up the text yet. Just Joshua chapter 10, for most of us, if you grew up in the church, Joshua chapter 10, you know it as the story in which God made the sun stand still. How many of you remember that story? Maybe from Sunday school class. Maybe you've heard about it before. God made the sun stand still. That's what the story's about, right? Joshua asked God in a prayer that the sun would stand still, the moon would not set in the night sky, and it would stand perfectly still, time would stop, so the Israelites could conquer their enemies. And that's what God did. God fulfilled that prayer. And so we teach our kids, and we even remind ourselves that oftentimes we remind ourselves this story is about God doing this amazing miracle, that God made time stop. Literally, time stopped. No other time in recorded history do we have a scenario where the time stopped. But my question here, when I read this story in Joshua chapter 10, which is what we're going to do here in a minute, is to ask the question, why did God make time stop? Why did God make the sun stand still? Was it simply because Joshua had enough faith? Was it simply because the Israelites believed enough? Was it simply because they prayed the right prayer? Or was it something else entirely? Because I'm convinced that God doesn't make the sun stand still just for any reason. God doesn't make the sun stand still just for any reason. You know, we often tell our kids, and I don't mean to say that this is wrong, and I don't mean to suggest it's wrong, because it's not, but we tell our kids, and we tell people we may know, that you can ask God of anything. If you want him to move a mountain, he'll move a mountain. And that's what Scripture says, right? Scripture says, if you ask him to move a mountain, he'll move that mountain. If you ask him to stop the sun, he'll stop the sun. If you ask him for a brand new car, you're going to get a brand new car. Sounds familiar. That's what some people teach. That's what sometimes we believe in our minds, that the teachings of this story that we're about to read are all about just asking God for stuff and he's going to do it for you. I think there's something a lot bigger going on in this story, and I want to share it, read it over with you. But before we get to it, messing with Caleb. Sorry, buddy. I need to give you a little bit of background. For those of you who weren't here with us last week, you know that the Israelites, last week, we read Joshua chapter 9, they found themselves in a difficult situation. The Israelites had been conquering city after city. It was clear to those who lived in the land of Canaan up until this point that God was with Israel and that God was going to give Israel the entire land of Canaan. The land of Canaan was theirs, but there were people living there already. And God's been handing these cities over to Israel, just making them powerless in their wake, in their drive to conquer the land. And so most of the cities have been gathering together, and they've decided to join forces together and fight the Israelites as a united front, to be a united army against the nation state of Israel. All except for one city, one group of people called the Gibeonites. Last week we read about the Gibeonites and how they approached Joshua and the leaders of Israel and deceived them. They deceived them into believing that they were from a far-off land, they were from some far-off city, they had traveled many, many miles to get there, and they were just kind of really at awe about what God was doing for Israel. And decided that, well, they wanted to join God in what he was doing, so they were asking the Israelites and asking Joshua to form an alliance with them, to join with them, and to swear an oath that they would never harm one another, and that they would be an ally from here on out. Well, the Israelites decided to agree to this alliance. They thought it was fine with them. These people seemed to be coming from a far-off land. It wasn't a problem for us. And only to discover a few days later that the Gibeonites, in fact, lived dead center in the middle of the land of Canaan. They were the largest, other than Jericho, one of the largest and powerful cities in the land of Canaan. And so now we've got the Israelites who are supposed to take the entire land for themselves. They're supposed to have all control over the entire land of Canaan, but now we've got this subsection, a small section in the middle, which Joshua and the leaders of Israel accidentally were tricked into joining an alliance, making an agreement that they wouldn't destroy these people. So now all of a sudden we've got Israel in this really messy relationship with the people of Gibeon. And they find themselves at a crossroads. They find themselves in a situation where, well, we'll see what happens here. Now we're going to read Joshua chapter 10. Thank you, Kate, for keeping up with me. Sorry about that. This is what Joshua has to say in the 10th chapter. He says, Adonizedek, the king of Jerusalem, this is before Jerusalem was part of Israel, heard that Joshua had captured and completely destroyed Ai and killed its king, just as he had destroyed the town of Jericho and killed its king. He also learned that the Gibeonites had made peace with Israel, and were now their allies. He and his people became very afraid when they heard all this, because Gibeon was a large town, as large as the royal cities and larger than Ai. And the Gibeonite men were strong warriors. So King Adonizedek of Jerusalem sent messengers to several other kings, Hoam of Hebron, Huram of Jermuth, Japhia of Lachish, and Deborah of Eglon. He wrote to them saying, "Come and help me destroy Gibeon, for they had made peace with Joshua and the people of Israel." So these five Amorite kings combined their armies for a united attack. They moved all their troops into place and attacked Gibeon. The men of Gibeon quickly sent messengers to Joshua in his camp in Gilgal. "Don't abandon your servants now," they pleaded. "Come at once, save us, help us." For all the Amorite kings who lived in the hill country had joined forces to attack us. So Joshua and his entire army, including his best warriors, left Gilgal and set out for Gibeon. "Do not be afraid of them," the Lord said to Joshua, "for I have given you victory over them. Not a single one of them will be able to stand up to you." Joshua traveled all night from Gilgal and took the Amorite army by surprise. The Lord threw them into a panic, and the Israelites slaughtered great numbers of them in Gibeon. Then the Israelites chased the enemy along the road of Beth Horon, killing them all along the way to Zekah and Makkedah. As the Amorites retreated down the road from Beth Horon, the Lord destroyed them with a terrible hailstorm from heaven that continued until they reached Zekah. The hail killed more of the enemy than the Israelites killed with the sword. On the day the Lord gave the Israelites victory over the Amorites, Joshua prayed to the Lord in front of all the people of Israel. He said, "Let the sun stand still over Gibeon, and the moon over the valley of Ayalon." So the sun stood still, and the moon stayed in place until the nation of Israel had defeated its enemies. Is this event not recorded in the book of Jashar? The sun stayed in the middle of the sky and did not set up as on a normal day. There has never been a day like this one before or since, when the Lord answered such a prayer. Surely the Lord fought for Israel that day. Then Joshua and the Israelite army returned to their camp at Gilgal. To say that the Israelites have a messy relationship with the Gibeonites would be the understatement of the day. The Gibeonites and the Israelites should be enemies. The Gibeonites and the Israelites should be foes with one another. They should be at each other's necks, because the Gibeonites deceived Israel. They completely tricked them into an alliance. If there's any nation that had a reason just to let two other people fight it out to their own deaths, it was Israel had a reason to let Gibeon and the Amorites kill each other. It was the answer to their problem, wasn't it? The Israelites made an alliance with Gibeon. They promised they wouldn't attack them, that they'd be allies. Sure, all fine and good. There'd be peace between them. But here we have a situation where the Amorites are much more powerful all of a sudden. They join forces with one another, and they're attacking the city of Gibeon. And so the Gibeonites find themselves in a position where they're probably going to be destroyed. And the Israelites, Joshua and the Israelites, have an option here. They have a choice. They really do. They can sit back and let those two fight it out, so they can just kill each other and not get in the middle, and let the alliance that the alliance they were duped into accepting just kind of fizzle itself out because the Gibeonites are destroyed. Or they can take their alliance seriously, even though they made it under false pretenses, and defend the nation of Gibeon. Now, if we were rational people, which nobody says that being Christians or being God's people in the Old Testament makes you rational. That's for one thing. You're not rational if you're following God, because He likes to do a rational thing. But if you're a rational person, you let those two nation states fight it out. You let them have it. Because the Gibeonites tricked you. You hate them. You don't like them. They're the neighbor that just showed up and asked you to borrow something and they never returned it. They're the boss that promised you a promotion and never gave it to you. They're the co-worker that you know in the cubicle next to you that promised to work alongside you and only end up being competing with you and taking a promotion that you deserved. The Gibeonites are not the people Israel should be coming to the defense of. The Gibeonites are the people they should just be letting have what's coming to them. The Gibeonites are the people that are getting what comes around, in the whole karma sense. The Gibeonites are getting what they deserve. But Joshua and the Israelites had something else entirely in mind, don't they? Joshua and the Israelites decide, instead of letting those two nations just fight each other to the death, that they're going to be committed to their covenant with them. They're going to be committed to the treaty that they made to them, even though it was made under false pretenses, even though it was made, it was an irrational decision, even though it doesn't make any sense to keep it. They made this decision, they made this alliance, and they're going to be committed to it. And they're going to go and defend the people of Gibeon and let the chips fall where they may. Now we find in the story that somewhere along the march from Gilgal to Gibeon, that Joshua and the leaders of the Israelites start having a conversation with God, because God responds. Joshua and the Israelite army, or Israelite leaders, have a conversation with God, and they're talking with God about the situation, and God responds saying, I am with you. I am with you all the way on this. And not only am I with you, as we see throughout the story, that God responds to this fight by aiding the Israelites as much as He can. He sends a hailstorm from heaven. And the text even says that more people died, more of the enemy died from the hailstorm from heaven than actually were killed by the Israelites themselves. So God is not only helping them, but He's leading the charge for the Israelites in their fight against the Amorites, and their desperate defense of the Gibeonites. In addition to that, Joshua knows that he has the Amorites on the run, and if you're going to keep this battle short and quick, you're going to finish it up in a day, you need the sun to stand still. Because if the sun sets and nighttime takes over, he knows the Amorites strategically have an opportunity to regroup, re-strategize, and figure out a way to flank the Israelites and take them down, bit by bit, however he can. So he asks God to help them even more, by doing something impossible. By literally stopping time. By literally stopping the revolution of the earth around the sun, and freezing time so that the Israelites can defeat the Amorites. Now, as I said before, most of us, when we teach the story or read the story, we just look at it and say it's just a story about God being more powerful than creation. He's the Lord, He's the Alpha and the Omega, He's the Lord over all creation. He's the Lion of Judah. He can do what He wants, so He can stop the sun, He can stop the moon, He can send hailstones from heaven to wipe out our enemies. And that's true. But God doesn't do this just on a random set of circumstances. God doesn't just decide, hey, this sounds like fun, let's shoot some hailstones out of heaven. Let's just stop the sun and wow the world. God doesn't just do that. It takes a very significant reason. And I think the reason that God decides to do what He does in the story is because He's so pleased with Israel's commitment to giving. He is so pleased with Israel's commitment to grace, being people of peace, being people of mercy, being people of love. He's so overwhelmed by the Israelites' maturity, their spiritual maturity here, And he literally stops the world to help them. Very few of you would probably say that the demolition of the house you grew up in would be the best thing that happened in your life. Very few of you would probably say that, but for the characters in the music video we watched before I got up to speak, that's probably exactly what they would say if they're here with us this morning. If you watch the video and you kind of follow what was happening in the music video, what you saw there were a bunch of siblings, 3 siblings, meeting at their family homestead upon the death of their father. And as you saw from the video, they didn't have the best of relationships with their father. Their father wasn't exactly the most loving type of father. He neglected one of his sons, and he let things just run amok in the house. People got hurt. People were at each other's necks. I mean, the house was just a wreck. Eventually, you saw near the end that the wife and the kid drove off. Obviously, there's some kind of a breakup happening there. And it was just a messy relationship. Just what we call less than ideal relationship between the father and his children. And that less than ideal relationship filtered down into the relationship amongst the kids too. We saw the kids, even as adults, were at each other's necks. They were throwing flower vases at one another, and they were climbing over one another, and almost tackling one another's kids, and just an ugly situation altogether. These are supposed to be brothers and sisters. These are supposed to be your siblings, your family, your loved ones. But here they are at each other's necks. The band that wrote this song is a band called The Shins. I don't know how many of you have ever heard The Shins before this morning? A few of you have. The Shins, I heard of them a couple years ago. I was first introduced to them. They're a band out of Washington State, I believe. And I was introduced to them when this song called Simple Song, was featured in the show How I Met Your Mother. How many of you have ever seen How I Met Your Mother? One of the best, in my opinion, one of the best sitcoms in modern history. It ended last year. And How I Met Your Mother it was a 9-season sitcom, all based around the idea of a father telling his children the story about how he met their mother. And for most of us, you would think that's a pretty simple story, is it not? I mean, it's a story about, we went to school together, or I met each other at work, or whatever. But the great part of the show, the whole basis for the show, was just how such a simple idea, how a man and a woman meet and they create a family together, is really, when you dig down deep, is much more complicated than we make it out to be. Relationships, friendships, family, all of those things, all of our relationships are so much more complicated than we give them credit for. They're often messy. They're often less than ideal. There's often strife and strain and tension and fighting, bickering, forgiveness, grace and fighting and bickering again and stress and strain. And there's all this packaged into, and oftentimes when we tell the story about how we met our spouses or maybe how we met the father or the mother of our children, oftentimes just encapsulated in a quick 5-minute story. But How I Met Your Mother made light of the fact that it is often more complicated and created a 9-season long sitcom off of that, out of the humor of that. And the song written by the Shins was based on the same theme. That our family relationships are oftentimes a lot messier, a lot less ideal than we like to make them out to be. They're often a lot more difficult than we make them out to be. And those messy relationships are often so complicated because we're just not willing to let go of things. We often allow messy relationships to just dictate our lives. And these messy relationships get even uglier and nastier because we let the house literally fall down on top of us because we just need to be right. Or we won't let the other person experience our forgiveness. We don't want to give them our love. And so we let the house crumble on top of us, figuratively, of course, in the video, literally. But we let the house crumble on top of us before we ever get the point of grace and forgiveness and commitment. Relationships are never, ever simple. If you consider yourself in a perfect relationship, you're either lying to yourself or you don't know the full picture of your own relationships with whomever it is, whether it be your spouse or a brother or a sister or a parent or even a friend. Relationships are messy and they're rarely simple. But it's within the messy reality of our less than ideal relationships that God wants to prove the power of His grace more than anywhere else in life. It's in the messy reality of our less than ideal relationships that God wants to prove the power of His grace more than almost anywhere else in life. In fact, I'm convinced, and from my experience, The greatest opportunity for God's grace to change lives stands in our awkward, uncomfortable, messy relationships. If you want to see God change lives, if you want to see the kingdom of God grow, if you want to see God's light shine down from heaven, if you want to see the biggest miracle in your life, then you've got to be committed to bringing peace and grace in some of the most difficult, awkward, messy relationships that you have. This is why Jesus answered Peter's question in Matthew chapter 18, which we have here. Caleb. Catch him off guard. Matthew chapter 18. Peter asked this question as Peter came to him and asked, Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times? Is that fair? 7 times? Is that enough? I mean, I've given him 1, 2, 3 strikes. Is that enough? 7 times? That's going above and beyond, right? No, not 7 times, Jesus replied, but 70 times 7. 70 times 7. And I don't want you to be somebody who takes those Jesus' words literally. They're like, I'm going 70 times 7. What is that? Do the math. That's not what Jesus is saying. What Jesus is saying there is that 7 and 70, those are in biblical terms complete numbers. Those are numbers of perfection. Those are numbers of wholeness. And so what Jesus is saying is that forever and ever and ever, you've got to be people of grace. You've got to forgive people over and over and over again. It is the only way that God's kingdom can grow. It is the only way relationships can be restored. It's the only way peace can surpass all the stress and the turmoil of our life. Is by grace happening, by being people of grace and forgiveness over and over and over again. And I know this isn't easy. Believe me, I know this isn't easy. I've got relationships in my own life, close relationships in my own life, that I'm still working on in my own way. But I'm working on being a person of grace and a person of peace. And I know some of you have wounds and scars that go beyond the pale in terms of how someone's hurt you. I know that there are likely some really extremely raw emotions in this room when you think of certain people or a certain person, perhaps. When the image of some individual comes to mind, the emotions can be extremely difficult to wrap your head around and to accept. You've probably been lied to. You may have been cheated on, whether that means in a relationship or another way you've been cheated on. You might have been taken advantage of in life. Maybe you've been neglected or abused. Someone may have stabbed you in the back and betrayed you in ways that are impossible to describe without breaking that down into tears. And I understand that. I know what that's like. And this morning I just want to say to you, and I'm saying this to myself, the advice, the word that God is moving me to say this morning is that the messier the relationship, the deeper the wound, the rawer the emotion, the more powerful God's light will shine upon the situation if you commit yourself to grace and peace. If you commit yourself to a relationship, regardless of how awkward it is, regardless of how hard it is, regardless of how messy it is, you will experience God's miraculous power in a very, very real way, just like the Israelites did. You just got to be committed to it. You've got to be committed, even when it doesn't make sense, to being people of grace, people of forgiveness. Before we go any further, I do want to say one thing, though, that I think behooves me saying, just in case someone here this morning is in this situation. God doesn't want you to be in an abusive relationship. So when we talk about being people of grace, being people of peace, it doesn't mean continuously putting yourself in harm's way, whether that's emotional or physical. So if you're in a relationship where abuse is a very real situation, that is not something I'm talking about you need to go back into and putting yourself into and making yourself vulnerable for. If that's a situation in your life, then we can have a conversation offline and separate privately, and we can work through that issue. But God is not a God who wants you to be in an abusive or ugly or hate-filled relationship for all of eternity. You're not locked into a situation where you're physically at risk, where you're emotionally at risk over and over again. But having said that, Sometimes it just, what some of us sometimes consider abuse. Sometimes it's just a matter of swallowing pride and saying, okay, I'm going to give somebody another chance. That doesn't mean making yourself vulnerable. It means just accepting somebody and loving somebody. And putting yourself in a situation in which peace and grace and love can grow. The choice we have is this. We have the choice to tear a house down, the house of our relationship, the house of our lives. Or we can see God make the sun stand still. We can continue to tear our relationships apart, continue to tear each other apart, or we can invite God to make the sun stand still, to move that mountain, so that love and grace and peace may abound. I have a quote here from Abraham Lincoln I want to read. I found this the other day. I thought it was really went along with what we're talking about. It says, want to know the best way to destroy your enemies? Make them your friends. Make them your friends. Whoever it is you think of when you hear the word enemy, that's the person you can make your friend. That's the only way you can ultimately destroy the real enemy, who is the devil himself. None of us are in ideal relationships. Like the Israelites were in the story, we are all in relationships that are messy, that are awkward, that are uncomfortable, that are just frustrating. And like the Israelites, we have a choice. We can either be committed to that relationship and make it work. We can be people of grace, we can be people of peace. Or we can just let people destroy themselves and let the world fall apart around us. If we want to see God do something powerful, like holding the sun in place, if we want to see amazing miracles like the moon stopping dead in its tracks, we have to first decide to stop. We have to first decide to stand by those who've done us wrong. We have to bend over backwards and demonstrate God's love and grace for even the worst of sinners. And by doing that, miracles will happen. Relationships will be restored, lives will change, and the kingdom of God will grow in mighty ways. The kingdom of God, which is ultimately what we're talking about, which is all that the Israelites are striving to build. It will grow in mighty ways if we commit ourselves to grace and peace and love. Let's pray.